And the background is talking about how we see the world around us. And when we look at the world, there's the earth there, we look at the earth, we can look at it through basically two different glasses. We can look at it through the light of biblical history, or we can look at it through the light of secular history. And those two are different, and they're based, of course, upon models of origins of evolution and creation. So we look at the world in possibly two different ways, and those two different ways will dictate how we perceive a whole lot of things. And I'll make reference to this a couple times tonight in a couple different areas that we cover. So let's just, for a moment, just summarize the first one, which is biblical history. The biblical history, of course, is based upon, you guessed it, the Bible. And in basing it on the Bible, we use the 7 C's. Here's a real good piece of shorthand to use. Creation, that is, God made the world in 6 days about 6,000 years ago. Corruption, the fall, Genesis chapter 3. The rebellion, the perfect world that God made on the 6 days, exists for 2 chapters of Genesis. And then in comes the fall and changes the whole nature of the creation. We'll talk a little bit about that in some of the answers. Then catastrophe, Noah's flood, and a couple of questions will relate directly to Noah's flood. Noah's flood itself, and then from Noah's flood, and we'll talk just a moment about this, Babel, confusion, okay, the confusion that comes with Babel, the dispersion, and then the rest of the C's of history relate to the biblical rescue that God has done for us, Christ, the cross, and then finally consummation, which is ultimately the end of history, which we haven't seen yet. So that's the biblical viewpoint. It's 6,000 years of history. The history is given to us in a somewhat summary form, but there's no such thing in this model as prehistoric. Prehistoric doesn't exist. Okay? It begins, the first verse of Genesis begins, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So we have all of history in that sense. We don't have all the details, but we have enough history to be able to track the history of mankind through that whole process. Now let's look at the other way to look, the other glass to look through. That's man's theories, rather than the Bible based upon man's own opinion and the model of evolution. And here we have a model that says the earth has been around and the universe for millions and millions of years, actually billions of years, and that life has occurred from non-life, and during this whole time, this whole millions of years time, there's always been pain, suffering, death, and struggle. That's a very different model than what the Bible has. The Bible has a perfect world in the beginning. At the Genesis chapter 3, the world falls. It comes into the bondage of sin, and we'll talk about that in one of the questions. And then later on, in the future, God's going to restore it back to the way it was in that perfect world in the beginning. So death in the creation model is a temporary event. It has a beginning, has an end. In this model, death does not. Death is always with us. Death is there from the beginning, and death continues throughout all of time. So there are two very different ways to look at the earth. And this one, of course, has a great prehistoric period. It has millions and millions of years before man exists, and then man comes into existence. So this model, based on evolution, also has a sequence of events that indicate in the beginning there's no life, then there's living single-celled organisms, then there's the beginning of multicellular organisms, then there's life in the ocean, then there's life on the land, and eventually there's reptiles, and then eventually there's people. So there's a sequence here of development that puts the different kinds of creatures in different time frames. That's very important as we get to our first question.